Hello, greetings from Taiwan. I'm Dai-Ling Chen from Taiwan. Very honored to be the presenter from East Asia, providing a distinct voice revolving around the study of threshold concepts. But at the very beginning of my presentation, I would like to introduce briefly the idea of critical cultural confidence that I introduced and applied in a class of teaching Chinese culture 2 years ago in China. All right. Yeah. This short video shows the concept or the idea of critical cultural confidence, how the three main themes under this concept, under this idea is introduced in the classroom. And the reason I introduced this idea was because of the wider social cultural context. Because in the specific context of China, cultural confidence is strongly publicized for national strength. So with the help of the threshold concept framework, I encourage the Chinese students to apply their understanding of cultural confidence critically from different perspectives for the purpose of communicating with other cultures. So in this specific discipline of English Chinese interpreting, I further used the threshold concept framework associated with self-determination theory to probe students' competence development in the discipline of English Chinese interpreting. And these are the parts included in my presentation, from the background and objective of the small scale empirical study to discussion, which is open for more suggestions and reflection. And the reason that I chose this topic as study was because my interest in studying the relationship between teaching and learning in higher education in any culture, particular cultural context. So in addition to using a novel teaching approach, the study is also aimed to explore the influence of the wider social cultural environment on students' academic performance and behavior. And from the teaching perspective, I attempted to investigate whether interpreting competence responds to a threshold concept and how the idea of threshold concept associated with SDT, the self-determination theory, helps us teachers to understand students' difficulty and transformation in the process of learning. And on the other hand, concerning students' learning experiences, self-determination theory was used to address whether interpreting competence to comprehend contextual knowledge, deverbalize between languages, and reformulate meaning responds to the characteristics of threshold concepts. And given the practical orientation of the discipline of interpreting, the interpreting competence is regarded as a threshold capability based on the threshold concept framework, because it involves judgment making and real-time responsive strategies in the actual situations of translating and interpreting. And in the context where in the specific Chinese context where translating the text about international affairs was involved, I used the media literacy approach to interpreting, comprising the elements of accessing, understanding, analyzing, and reconstructing media messages. So the objective of the study actually is twofold. First is to identify interpreting competence as the threshold capability based on the TCITF, the threshold interpreted theoretical framework, bringing together the threshold concept framework, judgment making, and the technical skills. Well, the second is to examine their students' attainment of interpreting competence and whether in the process of learning there was any difficulty, there was any hidden threshold barrier preventing the teachers from facilitating students to pass through the threshold. And as was mentioned above, interpreting is a practice-oriented discipline. So in turn, interpreting competence tends to be context sensitive and not limited to the linguistic abilities, but also includes extra linguistic knowledge and skills, or the open-minded, the open-minded attitudes, and the worldview of translation and interpreting. So in terms of defining in the interpreting competence, I drew on the idea from the interpretive theory of translation, in which there are three phases: from comprehension, deverbalization, to reformulation. Comprehension basically is about understanding of the context, understanding the different situations through linguistic and extra-linguistic abilities. And the verbalization is to discard the old messages in the source language, or to convert into the target language. And the reformulation is about the reconstruction of meaning in order to express for the target audience. And in terms of the definition of media literacy, there have been a variety of definitions, and it's not really a good idea to include all of them or most of them. Well, but at least the core idea of the definition of media literacy is concerned with accessing, analyzing, evaluating, reconstructing, meaning making of the media messages and media content. And the three organizations, including UNESCO, the National Association for Media Literacy Education in the United States, and the Center for Media Literacy, also highlight some of the important elements of media literacy, including such as knowledge, skills, and attitude, and judgment making and critical thinking. And so on the basis of what was argued above, the media literacy approach to interpreting can be built as the framework shows here. That is according to the interpretive theory of translation, three phases: comprehension, deverbalization, reformulation, response to the three phases, the condensed three phases of media literacy, from awareness, analysis, to reconstruction. And this is a cyclical model, but that is when students encounter a new situation of translating or interpreting a new context, a new text involving different topics or issues. They might have to experiencing their learning from the preliminary stage of comprehension, awareness, analysis, deverbalization, to reformulation, reconstruction. And that was the media literacy approach was the first framework used as the pedagogical model, pedagogical framework in the classroom. Well, the second framework is to integrate threshold concept framework and self-determination theory for the purpose of assessing students' performance in the class in the discipline of interpreting. And I would like to start from the argument that to understand the threshold concept, to step over the inside of precision, and it is social cultural. And according to the self-determination theory, it also reacts to the social environment, as well as considers and explores the effects of the social environment on self-motivation and personality integration, as well as conditions fostering the processes. So in this specific study, there are actually two layers, two inner layers, as well as two outer layers. The two inner layers of personal development involves what I just mentioned, self-motivation and personality integration, while the two outer layers of social environments include the environment of the micro environment, the micro classroom settings, as well as the macro social, the wider environment, macro social cultural environments. And the threshold concept framework is regarded as a bridge linking self-determination theory and media literacy based interpreting competence. So the simplified framework is presented here. To integrate TCF and SDT, and according to self-determination theories, taxonomy of motivation, and disciplines and across disciplines, students experience the gradation of motivation from a motivation, extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation. While on the extrinsic motivation, there are also 4 levels from external regulation, interjection, and identification to integration. So I integrate this model with a threshold concept modes of variation to categorize the stages, the 6 stages from the lowest stage of interpreting competence to the highest interpreting competence stage, in which students were expected to demonstrate their understanding of the contextual knowledge, their demonstration of the verbalization, that is to deverbalize between languages with sense, and to reformulate for expressing the meaning to the target audience. And also, in order to easily quantify their performance, I also categorize the students' marks from below 50 to 90 to 100. So in this process, as the gradation progresses, students were expected to internalize the knowledge and the skills in a more sophisticated way. Right, and there were 68 in the small scale study, empirical study, there were 68 Chinese undergraduate translation majors involved as the participants. And also because of the requirements of teaching them to interpreting the text about international affairs, I also divide the whole 17-week semester into 3 cycles, comprising the 3 themes of the trade war between the United States and China, Brexit, and the world international relations. And at the beginning of the course, students were asked to take the test, take the pre-assessment at the beginning of the course, and at the end of the course, they also took the final assessment to compare their if there was any improvement. So t-test was used to analyze if there was any statistical significance. And univariate analysis was also used to analyze the effect of performance based on media literacy phases, IC phases, on their performance of the final assessment. And in addition to the assessment of the media literacy based 3 phases, students also submitted their written reflection at the end of the course, at the very end of the course, to express their understanding of the context revolving around the 3 themes, the trade, Brexit, and the international work, international relations, as well as to express their ideas or where they thought the media literacy approach was conducive to the improvement of their interpreting. And these are the general results according to this study. The first, according to the t-test, it was found that the mean score of the final was statistically significantly higher than that of the pre-assessment, and students basically stay in the stage of introduction at the stage 3. And according to the results of the univariate analysis, the students' demonstration of IC based on media literacy also affected their final performance. But if we just look at, focus on the 3 phases of media literacy based IC interpreting competence, we can find that the most students, 39 students, actually were stuck in the preliminary stage of media literacy with a mean score of about 65. And in the following 2 phases, the number of students declined with higher mean scores. And after the analysis of their written reflection, there are basically 3 main categories to demonstrate their understanding of the context before they're interpreting. The first is that students tended to use, the first group, the students tended to use the neutral description just to describe what happened and what event, when the event happened and who was involved, like that. And some students, a group of students also held a harmonious view reflecting the Confucian worldview of achieving mutual benefits. And the phrase that they like to use is the win-win situation, especially after resolving conflicts or wishing to resolve the conflict between countries. And the third is the inclination to adopt discourse from the Chinese news media is probably based because of the limited access to the Western media or the world media. All right, so in the section of discussion, I'd like to highlight the 3 parts, the 3 points. The first is the point reflecting the stage, the IC stage, stage 3, that the majority of students stay. And according to Ryan and Deci, that their self-determination theory, it is partially internalized and behavior is regulated by internal rewards for self-esteem, blah, 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 like that, as you can read. And it also takes the form of ego involvement, referring to internally controlled regulation. And indeed, according to my observation in this study, I found that the Chinese students tended to rely on the teacher's instruction and guidance in learning, while especially in the micro classroom settings, while in the macro sense, they also tended to behave to meet the expectation of their social atmosphere. So, and the second is about the discrepancy between their recognition and their actual performance. That is, students all recognize the importance of contextual knowledge, right, to their understanding or to their demonstration of interpreting. Well, but according to the statistics, 39 out of 68 students were stuck in the preliminary stage of media literacy. Well, so students tended to cater to what's the wider social environment expect them to behave and perform, even though I used a kind of novel teaching approach. All right, so the 2-layer and the 3 dimensions of the threshold concept after conducting this research, I found that it might be of help for us to think about probing students' learning in terms of dominant layer, involving epistemological dimension, ontological dimension, and in the recessive layer, it involves the internalized dimension affected by the social cultural environment. Well, but the recessive layer, it's a challenge for public, at least for me, to explore, because it's hidden and it might be implicit. Or I also consider whether students really demonstrate how much they understood in interpreting, or how much they understood the context for interpreting. And interpreting competence, according to the research, responds to the characteristics, especially the three characteristics as transformative, interpretive, and troublesome. And I also listed the issues and questions, more like questions here for to invite all of you to think about, like especially the troublesomeness. After conducting this research, I considered whether troublesomeness was due to the threshold per se itself, or is because of students' experiences in their inner learning experiences that are more like implicit and hidden, or it's just because is it also related to the bounded teaching autonomy against the wider environment? For example, the selection of the teaching materials, right, to meet what the social environment, the social cultural environment needs. Right? And it also gives rise to the idea of the hidden threshold, which is hard to measure. And also attempted to explore whether some students held the internalized belief just because of the influence of the external environment, what external environment wanted them to believe. Or I also wanted to explore, but it's really hard, whether it's a choice, I believe that even though some students know that they are the influence of the external environment, probably they should choose the safest way in learning, because that's probably what the teacher want, what the society want them to behave, what the society want them to perform. Yeah, especially yeah, in this context. So it probably is also about the choice of following the GAM rule. Yeah, so if the TCF, the Special Concept Framework, supports teaching and learning as a reciprocal model, I also wanted to consider the effects of the wider social cultural environment on how any pedagogy is implemented. Okay. And that's the end of my presentation. And here are my references. Thank you. And I wonder if there is any question.